The day my father walked into my law office unannounced, I almost didn't recognize him. 7 years. That's how long it had been since he stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom and told me to pack my things and get out. 7 years since my mother turned her back while he said the words. 7 years since my younger brother smirked from the hallway like he'd won something. And now here he was, standing at the reception desk of Whitmore & Cole Family Law, asking my assistant if he could see the managing partner. He didn't know that was me? I should back up. My name is Vera. I'm 32 years old. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside beige siding, 2-car garage, a basketball hoop in the driveway my brother never actually used. We went to church on Sundays. My mother baked things for school fundraisers. My father coached Little League for exactly 1 season before deciding it cut into his golf schedule. What the neighbors never saw was what happened inside. My father had 2 children, but he really only had 1. My brother Kevin was his. From the time Kevin was old enough to hold a baseball, my father treated him like a project he was personally invested in. Kevin got the car at 16. Kevin got the college fund. Kevin got my father's full attention at every dinner table, every holiday, every moment that might have otherwise been ordinary. I got the scraps. And for a long time, I told myself that was fine, that I didn't need his approval, that I was doing okay. I wasn't okay, but I was surviving. I'd gotten a partial scholarship to Ohio State, not through my father's connections or his money, but through my own grades, my own applications, my own late night studying while Kevin was out with his friends. I picked up a waitressing job the first week of freshman year and kept it through all 3 years of law school. I shared a studio apartment with 2 other women the size of a walk-in closet and ate a lot of ramen and felt, for the first time in my life, like I was building something that was actually mine. My father's position on all of this was that I was being dramatic. The summer before my last year of law school, I came home for my grandmother's birthday. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was the only person in my family who treated me like I mattered. She pulled me aside in the kitchen that afternoon and told me she was proud of me, that she'd always known I'd do something real with my life. I remember holding her hand and thinking that no one else in that house would have said those words to me. That night, after the cake and the small talk and the obligatory family photos, my father called me into his office. I sat across from him at his desk like a job candidate, which, looking back, is exactly how he saw me, something to be evaluated and found lacking. He told me he'd decided to help Kevin buy a house. Kevin was 24, working a sales job he'd gotten through my father's college friend, living off an allowance my parents still sent every month. The house was going to be in a nice suburb outside Columbus, and my parents were contributing $40,000 toward the down payment. I waited for the part that involved me. There wasn't one. When I asked, and I regret asking, but I was 25 and still hopeful in ways I no longer am, he looked at me across that desk and said that Kevin needed more support right now because Kevin was trying to build a family. As though I wasn't a person building a life. As though the fact that I was doing it on my own made my life worth less. I drove back to my apartment that night and didn't sleep. 3 weeks later, I came back for a family dinner. I don't remember why I went. Habit, maybe. Or some remnant of hope I hadn't fully killed yet. My brother made a comment at the table, something about how I was going to end up alone because I cared more about my career than about finding a husband. He said it laughing, like it was a joke. My mother smiled into her salad. My father changed the subject. I put my fork down. I said calmly that I didn't appreciate being spoken to that way, that I was 25 years old and I deserved basic respect at the dinner table. My father told me I was being oversensitive. I said I wasn't. He told me if I was going to have an attitude in his house, I didn't have to be there. I said, fine, and then I left. And he called me 2 days later to tell me not to come back until I was ready to apologize. I never apologized. I finished law school. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I took a job at a mid-sized firm in Cincinnati, which was far enough from Columbus that I could breathe, and I worked harder than anyone else in that office for 4 years. I billed more hours. I took the cases no one wanted. I built a reputation for being thorough and relentless and apparently someone you wanted on your side when things got complicated. At 29, I was made junior partner. At 31, 2 senior partners invited me to join them in opening a new practice, Whitmore and Cole Family Law, located on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Cincinnati. My name wasn't in the title. That was part of the negotiation, and I was fine with it. What I was not fine with was the offer they initially made me, which I countered, professionally and precisely, until we arrived at something that reflected what I actually brought to the table. I owned 38% of the firm. My office had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Ohio River. I had a team of 4 associates and a paralegal named Gwen, who had been doing this longer than I'd been alive and who I trusted completely. I had a client base that included some of the most complex, high-stakes family law cases in the region. I had a life I had built from nothing, from a waitressing job and a scholarship and 7 years of refusing to stop. I had not spoken to my parents or my brother since I left that dinner table. I thought about them sometimes, not often, mostly when something good happened. A case I won, a new client referral, a moment that felt like proof. I noticed a small, quiet part of me that still wanted to tell someone in my family, and then I'd remember that no one in my family had ever actually wanted to hear it. So when my assistant called back to my office on a Tuesday afternoon in October to tell me there was a man in reception asking for the managing partner and he wouldn't give a last name, I didn't immediately think of my father. But then she described him. Late 50s, stocky, gray hair, wearing a sport coat like he'd dressed up for something. I told her to send him in. I stood behind my desk. I didn't come around to greet him. I watched the door open and saw my father walk into my office for the first time, and I noticed the exact moment he recognized me, because he stopped walking and something moved across his face that I couldn't entirely name. "Vera," he said. "Mr. Aldrich," I said, because that's how I speak to people who haven't earned anything warmer. He looked around the office, the windows, the view, the framed bar certificate on the wall. He looked at my name on the placard on my desk. He looked at me. "I didn't know you worked here," he said. "I don't work here," I said. "I own 1/3 of it. Sit down." He sat. I remained standing. He told me he was there on a legal matter. I told him I was listening. He shifted in the chair. My father, who had never in my memory looked uncomfortable, was uncomfortable, and he told me that he and my mother had come into some financial difficulty, that some investments hadn't performed the way he'd expected, that they were potentially facing foreclosure on the Columbus house. I let him finish. Then I asked him what he wanted from me specifically. He said he wanted advice. He said he remembered I was in law school and he thought maybe I could point him in the right direction. He said, law school, like I was still in it, like the 7 years that had passed were a waiting room he expected to find me still sitting in. I told him family law wasn't the right area for his situation, but I could refer him to a colleague in financial or real estate law. I wrote down a name and a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. He looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. I was also hoping, he said, that maybe we could talk about some kind of loan. There it was. I kept my face very still. It's something I learned to do in law school, and then in courtrooms, and then in every difficult conversation that required me to stay in control of the room. A loan, I said. Your mother and I are in a difficult position, he said. Kevin has his own family to worry about now, and we don't want to burden him. Kevin, who had received $40,000 toward a house. Kevin, whose car my father had paid for, whose college fund my father had filled, whose life my father had subsidized for the better part of 30 years. Kevin was not to be burdened. I'm not in a position to offer personal loans, I said. That's not something I do. Vera. That's not something I do, I said again. He leaned forward, and I saw it then, the version of my father I remembered from childhood, the one that appeared when he wasn't getting what he expected. The jaw tightening, the eyes going flat, the posture that said he was about to rearrange the conversation into something where he was still in charge. I understand you're still upset about how things ended between us, he said. But your mother and I are your parents. There's a responsibility there that doesn't just disappear. I want to be honest about what happened inside me when he said that, because I've spent a long time working through it, and I don't want to pretend I was made of stone in that moment. There was a part of me, the 25-year-old who drove away from that dinner table and cried for 2 hours on the highway, who felt something twist in her chest. The part that had wanted, for a very long time, for one of my parents to walk into a room and be proud of me. But the 32-year-old who had built this office, who had passed the bar, who had sat across from people in some of the worst moments of their lives and helped them find a way through, she was the one in charge now. And she was not interested in pretending that responsibility was a concept my father had ever applied to me. "Dad," I said, the first time I'd used that word in 7 years, "you told me not to come home until I apologized. I never apologized. I never came home. You made your position very clear." People say things in the heat of the moment. You said it in March. You called me 2 days later to confirm it. That's not heat of the moment. That's a decision. He was quiet. "I have a 2 o'clock, I said. "I've given you a referral. If you'd like to make an appointment with that attorney, Gwen at the front desk can help you with the conference room for the call." I paused, as a courtesy. "Because you're here." He stood up. He picked up the paper. He stood there for a moment like he was going to say something else, and I waited, and then he didn't. He walked out. I sat down after the door closed. I put both hands flat on the desk. I breathed. Gwen knocked 30 seconds later. She's been doing this long enough to know when to check in without asking. "You okay?" she said. "I'm fine," I said. "Hold my 2 o'clock for 10 minutes. She nodded and pulled the door shut. I looked out at the river. It was October and the light was doing something particular on the water, and I sat there for 10 minutes and let myself feel everything I needed to feel. Then I straightened my jacket and went back to work. That should have been the end of it. My father came back 3 weeks later. Not to my office this time. To a charity dinner I was attending on behalf of the firm. I saw him across the room before he saw me. He was with my mother, which meant she'd known, or found out, or he'd told her about the office, and they'd decided together to try again. My mother spotted me first. She came across the room with her arms slightly open, the way she does when she wants to suggest warmth without committing to it, and she said my name in a soft voice that meant we were doing a performance tonight. "Vera, sweetheart, you look wonderful." "Thank you," I said. "You both look well." My father shook my hand. He shook my hand. 7 years, and he shook my hand like we'd been introduced at a networking event. We made small talk for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I was watching the clock above the bar. Then my mother touched my arm and said she hoped we could all have dinner soon. That it had been too long. That it had been too long. That Kevin asked about me, which I was fairly certain wasn't true, but I nodded. Then my father said, quietly enough that it was just the 3 of us, I spoke to Whitmore. Graham Whitmore, one of my partners. I kept my face very still. "He mentioned the firm handles a lot of estate work," my father said. "I'd like to discuss some restructuring, move some assets around before things with the house get any worse. Graham said you were the best person to talk to." I looked at my father. I looked at my mother, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I thought about Graham, who knew exactly nothing about my family, and who would have had no reason not to mention my name. "That's thoughtful of Graham," I said. "But estate restructuring under those circumstances can raise some flags I don't think you want raised. I'd point you back toward my original referral. Vera." My mother's voice. "Lower now. We need help." "I know," I said. "I gave your husband a name 3 weeks ago." "We need family help," she said. "I don't know what that means," I said. "I haven't been family for 7 years. That was the decision that was made." My father stepped slightly closer, not threatening. He'd never been physically threatening, just the move of a man who was used to proximity conveying authority. "You've done very well for yourself," he said. "I can see that, and I'm proud of you for it." I had waited my entire life to hear my father say he was proud of me. I want to be honest about that too. I had constructed entire imaginary conversations in my apartment on bad nights, where he said exactly those words. Standing in that ballroom, hearing them come out of his mouth for the first time, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. Timing matters. 7 years too late, offered in exchange for a financial favor. Those words were not a gift. They were a transaction. "Thank you," I said. "I hope the situation with the house resolves itself." I excused myself and went to find my colleagues. I heard from Kevin 6 days later. An actual phone call, which surprised me. I hadn't spoken to my brother since I'd left Columbus, and I didn't know he still had my number. I almost didn't answer. I answered. He didn't open with pleasantries. Kevin had always been direct in the way that people are direct when they've never had to soften anything for anyone. He said Mom and Dad were in serious trouble. He said the investments had been worse than they'd let on. Something about a business venture my father had put a significant chunk of their savings into that had fallen apart. He said they were looking at losing the house within the next year if nothing changed. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said, "Vera, come on." "Come on, what, Kevin?" "They're getting older. You have money. This is what families do." I thought about the $40,000. I thought about the car and the college fund and the allowance and the sales job and the dinner table and the highway and the 7 years. "Do they know you called me?" I said. A pause. "No." "Okay," I said. "Here's what I'll tell you, and I want you to hear it clearly because I'll only say it once. I don't owe Mom and Dad a financial rescue. I built what I have without any support from this family. In fact, I built it after being specifically excluded from this family. If they'd like legal guidance, I've already provided a referral. If they'd like to actually talk, not about money, not about what I can do for them, but actually talk, they have my number." Kevin said that was cold. I said I'd learned from the best. He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, not because I was upset, more because I was aware that I had just done something final. I'd laid it out plainly, without anger, without pleading, without the 25-year-old on the highway. I'd said what was true and offered what was reasonable and declined what was not mine to give. It felt different than I'd expected it to feel. Not triumphant, not sad, just solid, like a door I'd closed gently instead of slamming. My mother called the next day. I let it go to voicemail. She called again the day after that, and I listened to both messages back to back while sitting in my car in the parking garage. She sounded like herself, careful, a little plaintive, choosing words that were designed to soften rather than to actually say anything. She said she missed me. She said she was sorry things had gotten so difficult. She said she hoped I knew how much she loved me. She did not say she was sorry for turning away at that dinner table while my father told me to leave. She did not say she was sorry for 7 years of silence. She could have broken at any time. She said she hoped we could talk soon. I listened to the voicemails twice. I put my phone in my bag. I went inside and had a very good day at work. Here's what I've come to understand. In the years since I drove away from Columbus with everything I owned in the back of a Honda Civic, there are two kinds of family. The kind you're born into and the kind you build. The kind you're born into and the kind you build. The kind you're born into can be wonderful. It can also be people who see you clearly and completely and decide you're worth less than someone else. And when that happens, when you spend your childhood in a house that has a hierarchy and you're at the bottom of it, you have two choices. You can keep trying to climb, or you can leave and build something level. I built something level. I built a career and a firm and a life in a city I chose, full of people who met me as I was and not as a comparison to someone else. I have a circle of friends who have celebrated every milestone with me without keeping score. I have colleagues who trust my judgment. I have a small apartment I love on the 4th floor of a building near the river, with a coffee shop on the ground floor and a bookstore 2 blocks away. I have a life that is genuinely mine. My father's visit to my office didn't ruin any of that. Neither did the phone calls or the charity dinner or Kevin's bluntness. Because here's what none of them understood. Walking into my world uninvited after 7 years, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires ongoing hope, hope that the thing will change, that the person will be different, that if you hold on to the feeling long enough, it will eventually mean something. I had moved past anger a long time ago. What I had instead was clarity. I referred them to a colleague in real estate law, as I said I would. I have no idea what became of the house. I don't have a reunion ending for this story. My father never apologized. My mother never said the specific words that might have actually meant something. Kevin never called again. What I have instead is this. I went back to my office on a Tuesday in October, and I sat at my desk by those windows overlooking the river. And I thought about everything I had built without anyone in that family believing I could. And then I picked up the phone and called a client who needed me, and I went to work. Some days that's enough. Most days it's more than enough. My life is not a revenge story. I never wanted it to be. I wanted a family that saw me, and I didn't get that, and for a long time I grieved it. But somewhere between the scholarship and the bar exam, and the partnership and the Tuesday in October, I stopped waiting for them to see me and started seeing myself instead. That's the part no one in that house ever gave me, and the most important thing I ever learned to give to myself. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the one in my office when my father walked in, and not the charity dinner, but the drive home after Kevin called. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my building for almost 20 minutes, not because I was falling apart, but because I needed to understand what I actually felt. And what I felt, more than anything, was tired. Not broken, just tired of carrying the weight of people who had never once offered to help me carry anything. I think about what it actually took to get from that dinner table in Columbus to that office on the 14th floor. Not the hours billed or the cases won, but the interior work. The choice made over and over again in small ways to keep going when there was no one behind me telling me I could. That kind of perseverance doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from deciding, somewhere deep and quiet, that your life is worth building even when no one around you is treating it that way. That's not stubbornness. That's something closer to integrity, a commitment to who you are even when it costs you something to stay that way. What I couldn't have told you at 25, but understand now, is that the hardest part of leaving wasn't the leaving, it was the thinking clearly afterward. It would have been so easy to make decisions from the wound, to cut off the world entirely, or to prove something to people who weren't watching, or to become so defended that nothing and no one could reach me. Intelligence. Real intelligence isn't just about knowing things. It's about knowing yourself well enough to act from your actual values instead of your pain. It's about being able to walk into a room where someone once diminished you and see the situation for exactly what it is, without distortion. When my father said he was proud of me, standing in that ballroom 7 years after he told me to leave, I understood something I'd been working toward without knowing it. The approval I had wanted my whole childhood was never going to feel like what I imagined, because the version I'd imagined was attached to being seen by someone who actually knew me. My father didn't know me. He knew the version of me that existed in relation to Kevin, which is to say he knew a comparison, not a person. What I built in those 7 years wasn't just a career, it was a self. A person who could sit across from her father in her own office, hear him ask for money, and respond with clarity instead of collapse. A person who had learned the hard way, the only way, that doing right by yourself and doing right by others are not opposites. They never were. I don't tell this story to say I got everything right. I don't know if I did. I know I chose my own life over a version of family that required me to be less than I was. I know that choice cost me things I still feel sometimes, on ordinary days, in ways I don't always have words for. But I also know that the life I have, the office, the river, the coffee shop downstairs, the colleagues who actually see me, exists because I made it. Not because anyone handed it to me. Not because I was given a head start or a safety net or the benefit of the doubt. Because I decided, early and alone and without much certainty, that I was worth the effort. That turned out to be enough.